Northern Montana, October 1889. The wind carried the scent of coming snow as 16-year-old Clara stood before the weathered structure that would either save them or condemn them to another winter of charity. Her younger sister Margaret, just 10, clutched her hand with fingers still soft from childhood, though her eyes held the weight of too much loss. The building before them barely qualified as shelter. 3 walls of rotting timber leaned inward like exhausted sentries, the roof a patchwork of missing shingles that revealed sky in a dozen places. The door hung from a single hinge, swaying in the October breeze. It was, by any reasonable assessment, a catastrophe. But it was theirs. $10 had transferred it from a dead prospector's estate to 2 orphaned girls who possessed nothing but determination and the clothes they wore. Clara felt Margaret's grip tighten as the land agent rode away, his horse's hoofbeats fading into the vast Montana silence. They had been alone for 4 months. Their father had died first, crushed beneath a fallen tree while clearing land. Their mother had followed 6 weeks later, her heart simply stopping one morning, as though life without her husband required more strength than it possessed. The town had taken them in with the grudging kindness of frontier communities that understood obligation but resented the burden. They had been passed between households like unwanted furniture, sleeping in barns and root cellars, earning their keep with endless chores that left their hands raw and backs aching. The whispers had started immediately. 2 girls alone, no family. The older one pretty enough to attract trouble. The younger one too small to be useful. They would not last the winter. Someone would have to take responsibility. The words had floated through walls and around corners, never quite spoken to their faces, but always loud enough to hear. Clara had made her decision on a Tuesday morning while scrubbing floors in the boarding house where they had been temporarily housed. The proprietor's son had cornered her in the hallway, his intentions written clearly in his wet smile and reaching hands. She had escaped, but the message was clear. They needed their own walls, their own door that locked, their own space where the world could not reach them without permission. She had counted their money that night by candlelight. $43, most of it from their mother's sewing and their father's last wages. Not enough for land, barely enough for supplies, but possibly enough for something no one else wanted. She had found the listing in the land office the next morning. One structure, partially collapsed, on 2 acres of rocky ground 5 miles from town. Previous owner deceased. No heirs. Minimum bid $10. The clerk had laughed when she inquired. The building was worthless, he explained. It would cost more to repair than to build new. She had placed $10 on his desk and asked for the deed. The town's response had been immediate and predictable. At the general store, the proprietor shook his head with theatrical sadness while refusing her credit. Those girls buying that death trap. Ought to be a law. His wife had been more direct. Orphans playing house. They'll be frozen corpses by Christmas, mark my words. At the feed store, men had stopped their conversation to stare as Clara inquired about lumber prices. One spat tobacco juice near her feet. Girl, you couldn't build a chicken coop, let alone fix that wreck. Another laughed, the sound harsh and dismissive. Your daddy couldn't make it work, and he was a man. What makes you think you can? She had stood silent, absorbing their contempt like blows, her face carefully blank. Margaret pressed against her side, small and trembling. Only the blacksmith had shown any kindness, and even his came wrapped in doubt. I'll sell you nails, he said quietly. But girl, that building is beyond saving. You'd be better off in town, even if it means swallowing your pride. But pride was all they had left. pride and each other, and the certainty that accepting charity meant accepting control. It meant sleeping where others dictated, eating what others provided, living according to others' rules. It meant Margaret would be separated from her, sent to a different household because no one wanted the burden of two. It meant Clara would eventually be married off to whoever would take her, her consent a formality at best. The frontier was hard on women, harder still on girls without protection. Clara had seen it happen before. Orphaned daughters absorbed into households, their labor extracted, their autonomy dissolved. Some were treated well. Others were not. None were free. Clara had decided that winter might kill them, but at least they would die as themselves in their own space. Having tried, it was better than the slow death of becoming someone else's property. They had moved in on a Thursday, carrying their possessions in 2 canvas bags. The interior was worse than the exterior. Animal droppings covered the floor in dried layers. The windows were empty frames, the glass long since shattered or stolen. A family of raccoons had nested in one corner, their presence announced by the stench of decay and scattered bones. The fireplace was choked with debris, its chimney partially collapsed. Water stains marked the walls where rain had poured through the broken roof. Margaret had started crying, silent tears that tracked through the dust on her face. Clara had set down her bag and taken her sister's shoulders firmly. "We will fix this. One thing at a time. We will make it work." They had spent their first night huddled together beneath their only blanket, listening to the wind whistle through gaps in the walls and the scurrying of creatures in the darkness. Neither had slept. The work had begun at dawn. Clara had learned construction by watching her father, absorbing knowledge she had not known she possessed until necessity demanded its retrieval. She knew that walls needed to be plumb, that roofs required proper pitch for drainage, that foundations must be level. She knew the names of tools and the purpose of each. She knew how to drive a nail straight and measure twice before cutting. But knowing and doing were separated by a chasm of physical strength and practical experience. The first board she tried to remove had splintered in her hands, the rotted wood crumbling like ancient paper. The first nail she attempted to pull had bent her father's old hammer claw. She had sat down hard in the dirt, frustration and despair washing over her. Margaret had appeared at her elbow with water from the creek, her small face serious. "Mama said you could do anything if you didn't give up." Clara had looked at her sister, this child who had lost everything but still offered encouragement, and had stood up. They had worked until darkness made it impossible to continue. The pattern had established itself over the following weeks. Rise before dawn, work until hands bled and muscles screamed. Sleep the dreamless sleep of exhaustion. Rise and repeat. Clara had learned to compensate for her lack of strength with leverage and patience. She could not tear down walls with brute force, but she could dismantle them board by board, carefully removing each nail, salvaging everything that might be reused. She could not lift heavy beams alone, but she could construct a pulley system using rope and a sturdy branch. She could not afford new materials, but she could scavenge from abandoned claims and offer to clear debris from other properties in exchange for their cast-offs. Margaret had become her assistant, learning to sort nails by size, to hold boards steady while Clara hammered, to mix mortar and carry water and perform the 1,000 small tasks that construction required. They had developed a rhythm, a wordless communication born of necessity and shared purpose. The town had watched their efforts with amused skepticism. On Sundays, when Clara and Margaret walked to town for supplies, They would pass clusters of people whose conversations would pause and then resume in whispers. Look at them, all dirty and sunburned, playing at being builders. The women had been particularly harsh, their judgment delivered in sidelong glances and pursed lips. No proper girl would behave so. Working like a man, it's unseemly. The children had been worse, throwing stones and taunting. Orphan girls in their broken house. Gonna freeze when winter comes. Clara had walked through it all with her head high and her hand tight around Margaret's, refusing to show how their words landed like physical blows. But at night, alone in their still broken shelter, she would sometimes allow herself to cry, silent tears that she wiped away before Margaret could see. The doubt was the worst part, the creeping certainty that perhaps they were right. Perhaps she was leading her sister toward disaster. Perhaps pride was not worth their lives. The roof had been her first major project. She had spent 3 days removing damaged shingles and assessing the underlying structure. 2 rafters were completely rotted and needed replacement. She had found suitable timber in a collapsed barn 2 miles away, carrying the beams back on her shoulders in a journey that took most of a day. Installing them required engineering a support system that would hold them in place while she secured them. She had used every rope they owned, creating a web of tension that allowed her to work alone. When the final nail had been driven and the supports removed, the rafters had held. She had stood in the center of the room, looking up at her work, and had felt something like hope. Margaret had clapped her hands, her face bright with joy. It looks like a real house now. The windows had come next. Glass was expensive, far beyond their means. But Clara had remembered seeing old windows in the back of the general store, damaged panes that the proprietor had set aside. She had offered to work for them, 2 weeks of labor in exchange for 4 windows. The proprietor had agreed, though his wife had protested. You're encouraging their foolishness. They'll die out there, and it'll be on your conscience. But the man had held firm, perhaps moved by some memory of his own hard beginnings. Clara had scrubbed floors and sorted inventory and hauled freight, working before and after her construction efforts. Her body pushed beyond what she had thought possible. Margaret had stayed at the shelter during these days, continuing smaller tasks, her loneliness a price they both paid. When Clara had finally installed the windows, sealing them with putty she had made from linseed oil and chalk dust, the transformation had been remarkable. The interior had become a defined space rather than an extension of the outdoors. Light came through glass instead of gaps. It had felt, for the first time, like something that might actually be called a home. October had slipped into November with alarming speed. The days grew shorter and colder, frost appearing on the ground each morning in intricate patterns that melted by noon. Clara had worked with increasing urgency, knowing that winter was approaching faster than her repairs. She had chinked the walls with a mixture of mud and grass, filling gaps that would otherwise allow wind and snow to penetrate. She had rebuilt the fireplace, carefully stacking stones and mixing mortar, testing the draft repeatedly until smoke drew properly up the chimney. She had constructed a door from salvaged boards, hanging it with hinges the blacksmith had given her at cost, installing a lock that was more symbolic than secure, but provided the illusion of safety. She had built crude furniture, a table from planks, chairs from stumps and boards, a bed frame that lifted them off the cold floor. Each project had taken longer than anticipated. Each had revealed new problems requiring solutions. But slowly, incrementally, the shelter had transformed into something that might sustain life through a Montana winter. The town's attitude had begun to shift, though skepticism remained dominant. The blacksmith had stopped by one afternoon, ostensibly to check on the hinges he had sold her. He had walked through the shelter slowly, his experienced eye assessing her work. "You've done better than I expected. Still, winter here is brutal. You'll need more firewood than you think, a lot more." He had helped her identify dead trees on her property that could be harvested, had shown her how to split logs efficiently, had left behind a wedge and maul with instructions to return them whenever convenient. It was kindness disguised as practicality, and Clara had accepted it gratefully. A few others had followed. An elderly woman had brought a bag of potatoes, her manner gruff, but her eyes kind. These were going to spoil anyway, though the potatoes were perfectly sound. A farmer had stopped his wagon and unloaded a cord of wood. "You cleared that debris from my north field. This is payment." The wood was worth far more than her labor had been, and they both knew it. These small mercies had sustained Clara as much as the physical help they provided. Margaret had changed during these weeks. The frightened child who had clung to Clara's hand had begun to show flashes of the person she might become. She had learned to start fires efficiently, to cook simple meals over the hearth, to mend their clothes with stitches that grew steadier with practice. She had created a small garden plot, planting it with seeds given by the elderly woman, tending it with fierce dedication, even as Clara explained that nothing would grow before winter killed it. The girl had insisted anyway, watering and weeding, talking to the plants as though encouragement might speed their growth. She had made friends with a stray dog that appeared one morning, a rangy creature with suspicious eyes and prominent ribs. Clara had protested that they could not afford to feed an animal, but Margaret had shared her own portions, and the dog had stayed. It had proven useful, barking at approaching strangers and keeping smaller predators away from their supplies. Margaret had named it courage, a word she pronounced with the gravity of prayer. By late November, the shelter had been transformed. It was not beautiful, not comfortable by any conventional measure, but it was sound. The roof kept out rain, the walls blocked wind, the fireplace provided heat, the door locked. They had a table and chairs and a bed. They had a small store of food, mostly potatoes and dried beans and flour, supplemented by rabbits that Clara had learned to trap. They had firewood stacked against the north wall, though never as much as the blacksmith had recommended. They had blankets and clothes and tools. They had survived the town's ridicule and their own inexperience. They had built something from nothing, 2 girls alone against the frontier's indifference. Clara had allowed herself to believe they might actually make it. She had stood outside one evening, looking at their shelter with its glowing windows and straight walls, and had felt pride swell in her chest. They had done this. Against all advice and expectation, they had created a home. December arrived with deceptive gentleness. The first snows were light, dusting the ground with white that melted by afternoon. The temperatures dropped but remained tolerable. Clara and Margaret had established routines that filled their days with purpose. Morning chores, fire building, breakfast preparation, water collection from the creek, midday work, firewood gathering, trap checking, endless small repairs, evening tasks, cooking, cleaning, mending by firelight. They read aloud from their mother's Bible, the only book they owned, finding comfort in familiar passages. They told stories, inventing elaborate tales that made them laugh and forget, temporarily, how precarious their situation remained. They sang songs their parents had taught them, their voices thin in the darkness but defiant. Margaret's cough had started in the second week of December, a small thing that Clara had initially dismissed as irritation from wood smoke. But it had persisted, growing deeper and more frequent. The girl's energy had begun to flag, her movements slower, her appetite diminished. Clara had felt the first tendrils of real fear. The blizzard had arrived on December 18th without warning. Clara had gone to check the traps that morning, under a gray sky that felt heavy but showed no immediate threat. She had been gone less than an hour, but when she emerged from the tree line with 2 rabbits, the world had changed. Snow was falling in thick curtains that obscured everything beyond a few yards. The wind had risen to a howl that seemed to come from all directions. The temperature had plummeted so rapidly she could feel her exposed skin burning with cold. She had run for the shelter, her heart hammering with panic, the rabbits forgotten and dropped in the snow. She had found Margaret huddled by the fireplace, her cough worse, her face flushed with fever. The girl had looked up with frightened eyes. "Clara, I don't feel well." Clara had pulled her close, feeling the heat radiating from her sister's body, and had understood that everything was about to become much worse. The storm had intensified throughout the day, transforming from snowfall to whiteout. Wind screamed around the shelter, finding every small gap and crack, sending icy drafts through spaces Clara had thought sealed. Snow accumulated against the walls, drifting to heights that blocked the lower portions of the windows. The temperature inside had dropped despite the roaring fire that Clara fed constantly, burning through their wood supply at an alarming rate. Margaret's fever had climbed, her cough becoming a harsh bark that shook her small frame. Clara had wrapped her in every blanket they owned, had made weak tea from their dwindling supplies, had held her and sung to her and tried not to let her terror show. The girl had drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid and frightened, sometimes delirious and calling for their mother. Clara had felt helplessness settle over her like a physical weight. They were 5 miles from town through impassable snow. She had no medicine, no experience with serious illness, no way to get help. She could only wait and hope and pray to a God who seemed very distant. The first night had been endless. Clara had not slept, keeping vigil by Margaret's side, monitoring her fever, stoking the fire, listening to the storm rage outside. The shelter had creaked and groaned under the wind's assault, sounds that made Clara wonder if her repairs would hold. Snow had found its way through the chimney despite her careful construction, hissing into the fire. The dog Courage had pressed against them both, his warmth welcome, his presence a small comfort. By dawn, Margaret's fever had not broken. The girl's breathing had become labored, her lips taking on a bluish tinge that Clara recognized from watching her mother's final decline. Pneumonia. The word had appeared in Clara's mind with the certainty of diagnosis. Her sister was dying, and there was nothing she could do. The storm showed no signs of abating. The snow had drifted against their door to a depth that made opening it impossible. They were trapped in their shelter, their home transformed into a potential tomb. Clara had made her decision as morning light filtered weakly through snow-covered windows. She would not let Margaret die without trying everything possible. The town had a doctor, a stern man who charged exorbitant fees but knew his profession. If she could reach him, bring him back, perhaps there was a chance. The storm made it nearly suicidal to attempt, but staying meant watching her sister slowly suffocate. She had dressed in every piece of clothing she owned, layering until she could barely move. She had taken rope from their supplies, tying one end around her waist and the other to the door handle, creating a lifeline that might guide her back if she became disoriented. She had kissed Margaret's burning forehead, whispering promises she was not certain she could keep. The girl had not responded, lost in fever dreams. Clara had forced open the door against the accumulated snow, had stepped into the storm, and had immediately understood she was probably going to die. The cold had been absolute and shocking, stealing breath from her lungs and freezing the moisture in her nose. The wind had hit her like a physical blow, nearly knocking her down. Snow had stung her exposed face like thrown sand. Visibility had been measured in feet rather than yards. She had oriented herself toward where she believed the town lay and had begun walking. Each step a battle against wind and drifts that sometimes reached her thighs. The rope had played out behind her, a fragile connection to safety that grew more tenuous with each yard. She had counted steps, trying to maintain direction, but the storm had been disorienting, the world reduced to white chaos. She had fallen repeatedly, struggling back to her feet, her strength draining with alarming speed. The cold had penetrated her layers, finding skin and stealing heat. Her hands and feet had gone numb. Her face had felt like frozen leather. She had pushed forward because stopping meant death, because Margaret needed her, because surrender was not acceptable. She had no idea how long she had been walking when she had collided with something solid. A fence post, she had realized, running her numb hands over its surface. She had followed it, using it as a guide, hoping it led somewhere useful. It had brought her to a barn, a massive structure that loomed suddenly out of the white. She had found the door, had forced it open, had stumbled into darkness and relative warmth. Animals had stirred in their stalls, disturbed by her entrance. She had collapsed in the straw, her body shaking violently, unable to move further. She had lain there, consciousness fading, thinking of Margaret alone and dying, thinking that she had failed, thinking that the town had been right all along. She had closed her eyes against tears that froze on her lashes. She had awakened to hands lifting her, voices speaking words she could not quite parse. The barn's owner had found her during his evening check of the animals, had recognized her despite her frozen state, had carried her to his house. His wife had stripped off Clara's frozen clothes, had wrapped her in blankets, had forced warm broth between her lips. Clara had tried to explain about Margaret, about the fever, about the desperate need for the doctor, but her words had come out slurred and confused. The farmer had understood enough. He had dressed for the storm, had taken his strongest horse, had ridden for town despite his wife's protests. The doctor had been reluctant, citing the storm and the distance and the foolishness of two girls living alone. But the farmer had been insistent, and perhaps the story of Clara's near-death journey had moved something in the physician's professional heart. They had set out together, the farmer leading, following roads he knew by instinct rather than sight. They had reached the shelter near midnight, nearly 24 hours after Clara had left. She had insisted on coming despite her weakened state, riding behind the farmer, terrified of what they would find. The shelter had been nearly buried in snow, only the roof visible above the drifts. They had dug out the door, had forced their way inside, had found Margaret unconscious and barely breathing, the fire reduced to embers, the dog Courage lying across her in a futile attempt to provide warmth. The doctor had worked quickly, his manner brusque but his hands gentle. He had administered medicines from his bag, had used techniques Clara did not understand, had finally stepped back with a non-committal grunt. She's very sick. It could go either way. But she's young, and she's fought this long. That counts for something. He had left instructions and medicines, had refused payment with a wave of his hand, had ridden back into the storm with the farmer. Clara had been left alone with her sister and the waiting. The vigil had lasted 3 more days. The storm had continued, trapping them in the shelter with dwindling supplies and uncertain hope. Clara had followed the doctor's instructions precisely, administering medicines at exact intervals, keeping Margaret warm, forcing water and broth between her lips whenever she was conscious enough to swallow. She had talked to her constantly, telling stories, sharing memories, refusing to let her sister slip away into silence. The fever had broken on the third night, Margaret's temperature dropping suddenly, her breathing easing, her eyes opening with something like recognition. Clara had wept then, great heaving sobs of relief and exhaustion and delayed terror. The girl had reached up with a weak hand to touch her sister's face. "You came back. I knew you would." Clara had held her, rocking gently, whispering thank you to God or fate or whatever force had allowed them to survive. The storm had ended on the fourth day, the wind dying as suddenly as it had risen, the snow stopping, the clouds breaking to reveal a sky of piercing blue. The world had been transformed, buried under feet of white, beautiful and deadly. Clara had dug out the door, had stood in the entrance looking at the changed landscape, had felt the sun on her face like a benediction. They had survived. Against odds and expectation and the frontier's indifference, they had endured. The shelter had held. Margaret was alive. They had made it through the winter's first test. The town's attitude had shifted completely after word of Clara's journey through the blizzard had spread. The story had grown in the telling, acquiring embellishments, but the core remained true. A 16-year-old girl had walked 5 miles through a killer storm to save her sister. She had nearly died in the attempt. She had succeeded against impossible odds. People who had mocked them now spoke with grudging respect. The general store proprietor had extended them credit without being asked. The blacksmith had appeared with tools and materials, claiming he was clearing out old inventory. Families had sent food and supplies, more than Clara and Margaret could possibly use. The elderly woman who had given them potatoes had visited, bringing a quilt she claimed she no longer needed, and staying to teach Margaret more advanced sewing techniques. The farmer who had saved Clara had checked on them regularly, bringing firewood and news from town, his gruff manner hiding what Clara recognized as genuine concern. Winter had continued its assault through January and February, but they had been prepared. The shelter had proven sound, Clara's repairs holding against wind and snow and cold. They had learned to read the weather, to anticipate storms and prepare accordingly. They had established relationships with neighbors who checked on them and whom they helped in return. Clara had worked odd jobs in town when weather permitted, earning money that she saved with fierce discipline. Margaret had recovered fully, her health returning along with her spirit. She had resumed her education through books borrowed from the town's small library, reading by firelight and asking Clara questions about things neither of them fully understood. The dog Courage had become a permanent fixture, his loyalty absolute. They had celebrated Christmas quietly, exchanging small handmade gifts, acknowledging the absence of their parents, but also the strength of their bond. They had survived. Spring had arrived in March with muddy thaws and returning birds. Clara and Margaret had emerged from winter leaner and harder, but unbroken. The shelter that had been a desperate gamble had become a genuine home. They had planted a real garden, using seeds and advice from the elderly woman, watching with satisfaction as green shoots emerged from dark soil. They had acquired chickens through trade, the birds providing eggs and a sense of permanence. They had continued improvements to their property, building a proper hen house and a small barn for a goat they hoped to purchase. Clara had been approached by several families seeking her help with construction projects, her reputation as a capable builder spreading through word of mouth. She had accepted the work, her confidence growing with each successful project. Margaret had begun attending school regularly, her quick mind impressing the teacher, her friendship with other children slowly developing despite the lingering stigma of being an orphan. The anniversary of their parents' deaths had passed in April, marked by tears and memories, but also by gratitude for survival. They had visited the graves, bringing wildflowers and sitting in silence, feeling the presence of those they had lost, but also the strength they had inherited. Clara had spoken aloud, telling her parents about the shelter, about the winter, about everything they had accomplished. She had promised to take care of Margaret, to honor the values they had been taught, to build a life worthy of the sacrifice their parents had made in bringing them to this hard land. Margaret had added her own words, her voice steady, her grief still present, but no longer overwhelming. They had walked back to their home, for it was truly that now, holding hands, their shadows long in the afternoon sun, two girls who had faced the frontier's worst and had not been broken. The town had fully accepted them by summer. They were no longer the orphan girls in the broken shelter, but the sisters who had survived, who had built something from nothing, who had proven that determination could overcome circumstance. Clara had been invited to join the Women's Auxiliary, a social organization she had once thought would never accept her. Margaret had been included in school activities and birthday celebrations, her status as an outsider gradually fading. They had been asked to share their story at a town meeting, Clara speaking haltingly about their journey, while Margaret sat beside her, her presence a testament to everything they had endured. The applause had been genuine, the respect hard-earned. They had become part of the community, not through charity or pity, but through their own efforts and resilience. Years would pass, and the shelter would be expanded and improved until it bore little resemblance to the wreck they had purchased for $10. Clara would marry eventually, a quiet man who respected her strength and loved her fierceness. Margaret would become a teacher, educating children across the territory, carrying forward the lessons learned in that desperate winter. They would never forget the months when survival had been uncertain, when each day had been a battle against cold and hunger and doubt. The experience had shaped them, had taught them that they were capable of far more than anyone had believed, that family was worth any sacrifice, that home was not a place but a commitment. The shelter that had nearly been their tomb had instead become their foundation, the place where two orphaned girls had learned they could face anything as long as they faced it together. The frontier had tested them with winter's fury and had found them equal to the challenge. They had bought a broken shelter for $10 and had built from it something priceless, proof that courage and love could overcome even the longest, darkest winter.